And the first question is from Chris Street. He's asked, have you ever considered the rise of the Moorish and Persian empires as an endgame for the Arab Spring? For instance, the Orontes River was always the line between the Moors and the Persians. If you could elaborate on this.
Perhaps is it Mr. Street would elaborate a little bit on what he means by this. It's a very broad question.
My concern is that the Maghreb, or the traditional home of the Moorish Empire, which ran the world for 700 years, is basically, to me, seems a charismatic leader could rise in that area, and you basically have the rise of a new empire, but an empire with great wealth and great capability. And that Syria was always the point of clash between Persia and that Moorish empire.
It's a very interesting point, and it really does bring in the fact that that whole region is a product of very long history. The clash between the Moors and the Persians, of course, it was the Ottomans that came in. In fact, so many of the Turkic peoples developed a number of different empires at that point. This is not just the only type of clash that we can really point to, though. There was, in many ways, the Crusades were there. There were the times afterwards of the Ottomans that reached all the way up to the gates of Vienna. This is a region in which large groups of people at different times, very rich, have had very, very different views than their neighbors, all clustered around that Mediterranean. And I appreciate very much that there is historical continuity. I think we cannot see the region without being very aware of the fact that it feels lines of history we can't even imagine in some ways in this country. On the other hand, it is also a region that is dealing with today's modern issues and feels itself very much having to take those issues and grip them and come to new conclusions. So I don't really see empire of any kind, under any charismatic leadership, in fact, as being a solution of our modern world. Our modern world depends on communication. It depends on technological savvy, which the Middle East, in fact, has shown in spades that it's very good at. And it depends on integration, which so much of the rhetoric that came out of the Arab Spring underscored over and over again. They want to be integrated into the global economy, they want to have jobs, and they want to have citizen activities in their governance. They want social justice. So these are universal rights, but they are not necessarily those that are protected by empire.
The next question is from Pai Ian. The question is, why was the Shah of Iran essentially abandoned by the U.S. in 1978-79? And this is per his own claims in his 1980 memoir, Answer to History.
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot, and it's of course a very complex answer, and politics, especially with the benefit of hindsight, proves that there are never simple answers, and so I would not even be able to phrase that question as the U.S. abandoning Iran, because states operate on very selfish national interests. And I have argued a great deal in my own study that states are also very emotional. And if something seems to be going against what seems to be in their best interest, they have no worries about what they leave behind. They go forward to serve their own people in their own best way. So, or what they perceive as their own best way. So I could not say that I would even agree with the question, but I do understand the sentiment behind it. And I think it is very clear that what was occurring at that time was that even unbeknownst to the United States, the people of Iran had abandoned the Shah. That was one of the most extreme extraordinary revolutions for a number of reasons, and one of them was that it was so covert. In effect, neither the Shah, the upper class, the American presence in Iran, and it depended on Iran significantly. It was the Middle East CIA center. It was a country that enabled the United States to place listening posts all along its northern border to watch the Soviet Union, its greatest enemy. So Iran was critical, and yet it was very clear. I was in Iran during that period, and I watched what was going on, but of course I couldn't really read what was on the walls any more than anybody else. This was a revolution that the US government was hit with broadside. It didn't realize what was going on. And the world in general was hit by it broadside because there had never been a conservative revolution. They'd always been leftist or communist or some other kist, but not really Islamist. Yes?
Can I have an addendum? That's my question.
Yes, I know it's your question. Thank you.
The shot to David Frost on ABC, actually to BBC News prior to his death, baldly asked how easily was it allowed that the Ayatollah Khomeini was more or less escorted into Iran? And to which there was obviously no answer by the occultist David Frost. I count that question, the counter side of it is, was there possibly any miscalculation on the part of Western intelligence, meaning CIA, MI6 et al., that Khomeini and his ilk might, keyword might, just be reliable enough? And that obviously a miscalculation. But initially, 1978 going into 79, the Brzezinski crew, were they thinking this might be a viable alternative, should the Shah not last, as a viable alternative to communists, obviously, because they would be another counter to the Soviets?
It was more than that. They thought, and it's recorded, and you can read this, that Khomeini was going to be like Gandhi, and that's what they called him, the Gandhi of Iran.
Who's they?
The CIA, the FBI, the intelligence services, the administration. Yes, it was very much at a short time. Didn't last long. Khomeini certainly didn't use the language that Gandhi had ever used. But certainly there was a period before he flew in and very soon after where there was the thought that this, black-robed cleric would lead the people in a very peaceful way, and that he didn't really have an agenda, that he would hand it over to other leaders. And they had a sense of who those leaders might be. And Bazargan, who took over the initial time, the Kerensky government equivalent, if you will, was very much that kind of leader, and how wrong all of that assessment was.
Thank you for that honesty.
The question is, if the clock were turned back to the time that Bashar al-Assad became president of Syria, and you were empowered to make foreign policy for the US, what would you do differently regarding relations with Syria?
I think one of the things that the United States has come to realize perhaps is not one of the easiest things for us to accept, is that we can't just go in and make decisions for other states. We might think it would be, to our interest anyway, if we could. Our own track record is not great when we have gone and done that, I would argue. So my view is I probably wouldn't have done a great deal because I don't think it's our place, and I don't think we have succeeded in those times when we have thought it was our place to do that. Bashar al-Assad also came in with a different image than he has certainly shown since. He came in with what was called the Damascus Spring. This was back in 2000. And the economy opened, and private investment started flourishing, and there was a great deal more encouragement of civil society, associations, professional associations, human rights associations, all of these began to flourish, and then, boom, he stopped it all. And the reason he stopped it all was he realized he had taken on a politically poisonous situation in the wake of his father dying, and he was going to have to fight for his life. So he did, and he went through that period, in fact, where Syria had to pull its troops out of Lebanon after the assassination of Rafik Hariri. He has gone through a real test of fire. Bashar al-Assad came out on the other side, had removed those people he didn't like or couldn't work with, who didn't want to work with him, and had his own core team when he began the chapter he's in now. So he started off much more strongly. The point is that he runs an autocratic country that has a military that is 5 times bigger than Libya's, in a territory that Gaddafi's military was much smaller than Assad's, and Assad's territory is much smaller. It's very well trained, and the country doesn't operate outside of the military. It owns 1/3 of the economy. It's intricately tied into every aspect of that society. Any kind of attack on Bashar al-Assad was an attack on the military, was in fact an attack on the entire autocratic system. And there are no options but to attack back. And that's why he hit so far and so fast and so badly. There are no options in an authoritarian regime like that.
The next question is from our distinguished member, Farmanfarmain. President Obama said in an interview with an Israeli radio that Iran has a year before it can produce a nuclear weapon. Does this statement establish a red line by the U.S., and what are the consequences?
Thank you, Dr. Amiri. I have to say I've become a cynic about these prognostications. Israel has been saying that Iran is going to be producing a nuclear bomb for a decade, and the time frame has always been 2 years, 3 years, and we've crossed those 2 years and there's still no bomb, and we've got another 2 years, and red lines have become part of the language now, but it wasn't really about 8 years ago, 9 years ago for those of us who watched this. So if we look at a year, if we look at Obama's language and say, okay, he's saying a year, it may have nothing to do with whether Iran is creating a bomb or not. In fact, very, very much, it is pretty clear that the whole nuclear issue, because it is very unsure what Iran has developed. Iran has not ever gone to the point where it has actually developed a bomb. And it's very possible, and so the language has changed to intending to create a bomb. And that's one of the biggest problems of the negotiation, is that nobody actually has the same facts, and nobody agrees as to what facts are important. And the whole reason behind that is that there's the backstory that's much more important, and that is that the United States doesn't like the regime in Iran, and Israel doesn't either, and would like to replace the regime, because if the regime was different, maybe an Iranian bomb would be much more palatable. And, there's not an Iranian leader since the Shah, by the way, that has not promoted a nuclear program. So no matter who replaces the current regime, they'll probably want one. So better to get one that is a regime that's a friend of the West and of Israel. Iran's perspective is it has a right to develop nuclear power as long as it's doing it inside the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And on top of that, Israel is not a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, so it feels as though it's really bending over backwards. It's got people in there all the time looking and checking things out, and it doesn't really feel as though it's in a dangerous neighborhood. It doesn't feel as though it's really deserving of all of this negative international sanctioning and everything else. But of course, that's because its regime feels very anti-West and doesn't understand it from the other side. So it's the backstory. So if Obama is saying a year red line, that simply babies Obama's agenda for something completely different, to do with regime change, dealing with Israel's concerns, working out these days Saudi's concerns, what's going on in the Gulf. There's all sorts of bleeding out of Syria, as I've just said. There's all sorts of other aspects that actually may have nothing to do with the actual production of weapon of mass destruction. But as a last coda, my general feel is it's not in Iran's interest to develop a weapon of mass destruction, certainly not at this point. It's obviously going to be on the receiving end of an awful lot of gunfire and smoke and all the rest of it if it were to develop it. So it's not terribly useful for it to do this. Much better is it for it simply to keep building, keep doing. It's obviously able to survive sanctions quite well, and just watch that sanction regime unravel and unravel some more.
The next question is from longstanding member Santosh Mohanty. What do you believe are Russia and China's interests and goals in the Middle East?